All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and we'll keep going. All right, so we're gonna talk about why it is that women's anatomical features or female sex anatomical features tend to be more medicalized. Women of color and the issues that pop up due to being female and or the intersection of race and or the intersection of disability. Women of color have higher maternal and infant mortality rates, both in the US and globally. People of color have very limited access to healthcare. There's been consistent inequalities within healthcare structures. There's been consistent misunderstandings about how race impacts health and or stereotyping that has been done within the healthcare to automatically assume a lack of care or physical conditions that will leave you with predispositions to specific healthcare outcomes. Female reproductive organs and the assumptions of emotional instability, right? So she's going to be on her period, so she can't be in positions of power because maybe on her period she'll do something irrational or what have you. There's been a long time this assumption that we're with female reproductive organs and emotional instability. For a long time, there was a diagnosis for women that were not sexually active enough, were too sexually active, were feeling any kind of way that wasn't under the social norm, and they would call it female hysteria. And the treatments for this included hysterectomy and institutionalization. And really, it was just a wide variety of different medical ailments, both mental and physical, that would fall under this category. And sometimes not even ailments, right? Sometimes they were just living their best life, and people decided that made them too feminine or too sexual or what have you, in ways that did not fit their ideal understanding of feminine. And it created like the ability to medically treat someone for things that in ways that were not representative of how to treat these things, or even whether or not they needed treated. Females were more likely to receive medications for mental health, while they are less likely to receive pain medications. So the section on breast cancer is very informative, and it's something that we really need to kind of think about as we get into those months. And there are very many of us that have been touched by or have individuals that are close to us that have had breast cancer or currently have breast cancer or have died from breast cancer. 1 in 8 women will have breast cancer in their lifetime. Only skin cancer is more common in women of the cancers. Solutions are medically focused and lack environmental change because there are massive ties to environmental problems. Breast cancer tends to be incredibly high because of the fact that it is the organ that is grown past the point in which you're in the womb. So there's less of a filtration system essentially to the nutrients that get into your body. So thus, if there are hormone imbalances, if there are toxins, if there are any kind of things that can damage cellular function, those things are going to impact the organs that grow or are currently growing once you leave the womb. And breast, because it is the last organ on the woman that is currently, or that is developed, it ends up maintaining or getting a large portion of those toxins in its creation, and that can form cancerous cells. However, screenings are available in multiple locations. Anywhere that does, any OBGYN are going to do breast screenings. You can also get breast screenings done and preventative care done at the University Health Center. You can also get it done at any Planned Parenthood. You can get it done at most women's health clinics. You can get it done at the health department as well. All of these places are sources for where you can do preventative care for things such as breast screenings or any kind of pap smear or any kind of female wellness checks. There is environmental estrogen that forms within certain kinds of plants, certain kinds of things that we eat. I think they talk a lot about soy in there that can throw off estrogen levels within the human body when that becomes a primary staple of the diet. So there is very interesting ties to environmental and ecological concerns when it comes to some of these particular kinds of ailments, dealing with any kind of estrogen production and or any kind of tissue building after you are out of the womb. When you talk about breast science, or when you talk about any kind of science that comes and has to do with like female bodies, it is a lot of the time dealt with still in or through the male gaze. And what I mean by that is that there are still male scientists, they're still looking at science through this lens of how do we make or create women or fix women to make them into this ideal body shape type functionality. All right, so we're going to get into the medical model of disability real quick. And this is really just talking about how we see disability versus ability. Okay, so is disability inherently abnormal? We view disability currently in our model as inherently abnormal or unhealthy. It's seen as this, and disability as a whole, right? So disability itself has a wide variety of understanding. So depending on whether that's a physical disability, an emotional one, a mental disability, an intersection of multiple, if you have a chronic illness, if you have a medical ailment that may not be as easy to pinpoint in a person, we inherently see these as something to be fixed. We inherently see these as something that you have to see. We tend to not pay attention to the disabilities that we can't necessarily hew in on. We tend to pay less attention to, or we tend to be less intersectional, be less mindful of the disabilities that we can't physically see with our own eyes. And there's a medical model to disability, which means that, again, they're trying to fix it. There's always this consistent desire to keep that as the abnormal, keep that as something that we don't revere. There's always, when we talk about disability, we have talked about overcoming disability. We talk about doing things despite disability, but disability never becomes something that is the normal. And I like how the book talks about a defiant body. So like the body is not disabled, but it's defiant. It's not accepting to cultural norms. It's something that is unique and different, but not less. Okay, so we're going to get into reproductive justice. We're going to get into a history of harm, and then I'm going to pause, and then, well, I might get through parenting options and contraceptives, but then when we get to the abortion, I will start a new one, because that in and of itself is going to be a lecture. So reproductive justice involves access to safe and affordable birthing and parenting options. It's reliable, safe, and affordable birth control technologies, freedom from forced sterilization, and the ability of having or obtaining an abortion. So there's a unique history. Well, not as unique as it should be, but there is a colonialization factor to a history of harm that has come in the United States in its medical history. There's been many experimentations done on minority women, so non-consensual. There are slaves in the modern gynecology. I have a picture of them down here, where he would perform hysterectomies. He would perform surgeries and explore their female reproductive tracts without giving them anesthetics. And the scientific discoveries were wholeheartedly revered, as opposed to there being any kind of ethics questions about the fact that these women were essentially tortured in order to figure out some of these medical complexities. Another example is Henrietta Lacks. She's up here in this corner. She is the woman that had essentially the miracle cell, or the cell that replicates on its own and allows us the ability to do medical testing on a cellular level. However, her cells were non-consensually taken, and they have been patented, and they are now medical property. And the family, despite the fact that most medical facilities and research facilities use these cells, and these cells are continuing to be utilized, and that biological property is no longer hers or her family's, and it never has been. And so they reap none of the benefits off of the scientific discoveries or anything that it comes out of using her cells. She's a very interesting person, and the debate surrounding that is very interesting. And I suggest going and looking into it, because it's something that we need to be aware of, especially as we start having people and scientists patent certain parts of the genome and certain sections of genes, and what that means for us moving medically forward as our own lab tests and our own testing becomes part of data collected by medical entities, and how and what that means for us as our own physical property of self. Indigenous children in U.S. schools, they were yanked from their own areas, their own places of living, their own, wow, that word is gone. And then they were taken and made to go to U.S. schools. Essentially, they were kidnapped to learn Christian ideology, so that they couldn't learn their own language, they couldn't learn their own teaching ways. And a lot of these Indigenous children were also vaccine guinea pigs. They were also essentially not treated like human beings. And part of the missing and murdered Indigenous persons movement is to, and part of the identifying the children that were killed at the schools within Canada and the US, is uncovering the amount of harms that were done to these children while in these schools. And then you have the Tuskegee experiment, which was essentially trying to get medical ailments or treatments for syphilis. And so they took a bunch of people who had syphilis and gave one section the medicine and one section a placebo, and essentially watched which group died, and if the medicine kept them from dying, but did not offer any medical services to the placebo group, which was incredibly harmful, obviously, and unethical. And so there is a long history of experimentation on minority groups, including women. And then we're going to get into forced sterilization. Forced sterilization is still something that is legal in the majority of states. We have so much history of sterilization of Indigenous women, of sterilization of women of color, especially Black women when they were in slavery, especially migrant women in deportation centers. The sterilization of anyone with a disability, especially mental illness disabilities, or diagnosis. We still sterilize prisoners. We will let women who have history of drug abuse, when they're still like in their hearings or what have you, they are sometimes given the option for a sentence reduction if they will go along with the sterilization. Sometimes they're not as sober as they should be when making that decision. But the fact that they leverage freedom for sterilization is problematic and unethical in and of itself. But these things are still happening. And especially around the world, forced sterilization of women is still a very big deal. And it's something that we need to really keep an eye on. The other part of this I want to talk about is the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement happened in the US prior and alongside with the Nazi movement in Germany. And essentially, it was a movement to declare to attempt to make a perfect human, and to track pedigrees so that you didn't have bad blood or what have you, which included any kind of minority status, so any kind of disability, any kind of racial implication that wasn't white, any kind of illness at all, any kind of immigrant status, any of these things, to try and do this. And you got papers, and you again were sterilized if you didn't make the cut, and there were social sanctions aside from that if you weren't perfectly in the pedigree that they wanted. And so while we talk about how Nazism was incredibly horrible and inhumane, the eugenics movement was equally horrible and inhumane. And while we did not have gas chambers, we did forcibly sterilize a lot of women during that time. And it is something that, as we move through history and as we move through a system where hate is still rampant, we need to be mindful of these histories, and we need to figure out how to make sure that they do not end up doing the same thing. And we need to make sure we figure out ways in which we don't repeat terrible atrocities. Just for graphics, this is the legislation in 1935, and how many states had eugenic sterilization as a legal practice. So you could legally sterilize somebody if they did not fit the eugenics movement's standards. And these are the states that currently still allow forced sterilization. So just for your own personal knowledge, there are only 2 states in the country that have banned forced sterilization. All right, so parenting options real quick. There are a lot of different motivations for being a parent or not being a parent, and all of them are valid. Point blank, full stop. That could be the whole lecture slide. However, we want to dive a little deeper than that. So the motivations for having children can be something like economic security in old age, emotional and marital fulfillment, carrying on the family name, religious duty, cultural assumptions of who you are and what you should be. Motivations for not having kids or limiting fertility can be health concerns, finite resources, and or world population concerns. Children and birthing are expensive. True story. They are expensive little eating machines. Women are primary care, which means that limits autonomy and options, and can leave other parts of your life with less ability to do those at the level that you want to, or with the amount of time that you want to. Assisted reproductive technologies such as we now have fertility medications, we have in vitro fertilization, we have surrogacy, we have all sorts of different ways in which fertility issues can be remedied, and or other ways in which someone can have a baby. Access to these options are obviously limited by socioeconomic status. They're limited by cultural status. They're limited by sexuality status. They're limited by gender identity. They're limited by race, right? So there are biases within these programs that allow or maintain or create obstacles for specific groups. None of these objects are inherently liberating and or entirely oppressive, right? So like, none of these options are saying that birth is necessarily like, or none of them are saying that you can't be a mom, and none of them are saying that being a mom should be everything that you are. But a lot of motherhood gets tied into women's self-worth in ways that when infertility happens, um, there needed to be a fix for that, because women who were infertile were considered less than or feel less than. And that in and of itself has an oppressive nature. However, having these options doesn't necessarily liberate them from that feeling either, right? And so just kind of making sure as you talk through that and thinking of that, that you're thinking about how those technologies impact women's lives. Unwanted births happen in a lot of different ways, but not traditionally. Statistically, they are more likely to happen when they are teen pregnancies in lower income women, and or through single moms. Parenting in same-sex and queer relationships can happen in a lot of number of ways. You can have biological children within those relationships to one or more of the parents, depending on what kind of relationship that is. You can adopt, you can inseminate. There's a significant amount of discrimination, and the Supreme Court just ruled not that long ago that any kind of religious adoption agency can disqualify LGBTQ plus persons from adopting anyone that is through their agency. So there is that. All the different contraceptive techniques, and these are all kind of laid out in your book, so I'm not going to go too much into them or read them off to you. I will kind of touch on a couple of things. The voluntary motherhood movement and Margaret Sanger, which is really this movement to say that family planning was important and that women should have the control over when and how they have babies. Eugenics and birth control. Again, eugenics was did a lot of forced sterilization, and that caused a lot of powerlessness when it came to family planning for multiple different marginalized groups or marginalized women. The marital clause, just this idea that in order to access birth control or access any kind of family planning, you had to be married. So there is that. And so I also want to touch base real quick on the morning after pill and its difference than the letters and numbers that we'll get into when we talk about abortion. The morning after pill is not an abortion. It is not taking away a pregnancy. It is essentially a larger quantity dose of the hormones that are in birth control pills, and essentially just prevents that woman from the ovulation process to like the insemination process to begin with. So in the same way that the birth control pill, the morning after pill, just does that in a larger quantity to make sure that there is no connection to begin with. So I just want to make that clear so that when you have conversations about the morning after pill, you are properly educated on what it actually does. All right. So our next conversation is going to be abortion. So I will get off here and I will get back on here on a separate lecture so that we have the capability of really diving into that topic in a way that is meaningful. And because it provides so many emotions and feelings surrounding it, and it is such a hotly debated topic, I want to give it its own lecture so that people can take their time and process it as we go. All right. I hope you have a great week.